Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, and this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. These are a couple upcoming events that you can find more information here, also on our website. And we do offer advertising in our newsletter, so you can email this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Anthony Anikief, and he's going to be covering teaming agreements versus subcontracting. Anthony, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to visit. I lead up the government contracts practice at Williams Mullen, along with my co-lead, Bob Korok, and represent a variety of small, emerging, and large businesses domestically and internationally throughout the life cycle of the government contract cycle. The title that we're talking today, I'm glad you've joined us, is the first of two related topics that are going to talk about subcontracts and teaming. Next, please. So as we get into the subject a little bit, the title itself is a little bit of a misnomer in that teaming agreements and subcontracts are not really in conflict with each other. What we'll be covering should establish that teaming and subcontract agreements are really part of a larger government contracts continuum process. And that's what we'll be addressing today. How the two teaming agreements or arrangements really are nestled into the overall process, and then some of the details about teaming agreements and subcontracts and some pointers. As a practice point, the other seminar will focus a little more heavily on teaming agreements themselves. Next, please. So, as we dive into this a little bit, all too often our experience is we receive calls from clients or prospects asking us to dash off a teaming agreement or a subcontract, and surprisingly, we find that many of them are seeking us to have us draft this type of document more because that's what's expected than considering the context of the situation. It's important to consider that these documents are really part of an overall continuum in which one needs to think about one's particular situation and the goals one's seeking to achieve. First of all, is it necessary to team at all? And if so, why? Certainly, there are pros and cons to doing both, which we'll discuss. But if you can go it alone, that may be the best solution. If you think you're going to move forward, you need to do market research with regard to your potential teammates, and you're going to be sharing secret or private information, so you'll want to enter into a non-disclosure agreement, which is a document that sets out the rights and responsibilities of the parties when sharing confidential or proprietary information. It's a document that will continue to live through the teaming agreement process, and unless replaced in the subcontract, will continue into the subcontract as well. It's also necessary, as you narrow it down, to do due diligence on your potential teammate or potential subcontractor. And that involves things as simple as checking SAM to see that they're not debarred, checking Dun & Bradstreet, looking at their web page on the internet. In more serious situations, it might involve interviewing them and talking to some of their customers. And with that, you'll be moving into the teaming agreement process, which will hopefully lead to a subcontract. Next, please. So let's look a little bit about what a teaming agreement is and what the FAR has to say. Interestingly, the FAR does not define a teaming agreement. What it provides for is a contract team arrangement. And in fact, there are two types. There's a horizontal teaming arrangement, which is, for the most part, a joint venture situation, which we'll deal with briefly. And then the second type of situation, which is a vertical teaming agreement, which is the more traditional prime and subcontractor arrangement. The teaming agreement itself, without a FAR definition, is simply the document that is used to memorialize the contract team arrangement. The FAR, under the FAR, Part 9.603, the government will approve any teaming arrangement if it's properly disclosed in full at the appropriate time. Next. So, why should you team or not? And it really depends on the perspective that you have. It may differ for a prime or a sub, a big or a small company, an experienced or new entity. There are certainly pros for entering into one. They fall really into two groups. The first is to expand your offering capability in terms of experience or technical capability or staffing, or meeting particular requirements of the government. And the second is to reduce risk in terms of the cost of developing a proposal or sharing the cost in case you lose. If you're a small business, there's also the possibility of entering into a new market and gaining market share. There are also negatives. You lose independence and control as compared to when you do it yourself. You have to rely on others, and you have to risk the possibility that they'll let you down. You lose the ability for organic skill development internally. You have to share the revenues and the profits. And you risk the loss, although slight if you've done a good NDA, you risk the loss of internal information that's proprietary. And if you're helping out a small business, you may be generating a new competitor. Next, please. So let's first look at the horizontal teaming situation, which is really a joint venture. And it comes up in a variety of situations. You're creating a new entity. It could be a contractual partnership. It could be the formation of an LLC or a corporation. Whether you're a partner or a member shareholder, you're really creating a new type of entity whose goal is going to be to bid on a pending solicitation or future solicitation or group of solicitations. It's important to note that a JV itself has no history, experience, or past performance. So it's necessary to see if the agency that you're going to be dealing with will consider the past performance of its members, which may or may not be possible. There's no single FAR definition about it. There are a variety of definitions throughout the FAR depending on the circumstances. And the key decision that people make often are whether they're populated or unpopulated. Populated being one where the JV itself hires its own people to perform the work. Unpopulated JVs require its members to provide the substantive staffing, although they're entitled to have some administrative staff. It's important to note that now the SBA has barred the use of populated JVs both for small business joint ventures and mentor-protege joint ventures, which we'll be discussing in a bit. And the reason is that the SBA believes that a populated joint venture will shut out the small business from getting its benefits. Let's turn to the next slide, in which we'll talk a little bit about the key terms of a joint venture. Really, there's nothing very special. It's a lot like the operating agreement or the articles and corporations or bylaws of the corporation or LLC that you're currently a part of. You need to have its scope, which is what are we going to be doing? Usually going after a solicitation or something like that. We need to talk about the ownership, who's going to own it, control it, manage it, who's putting skin in the game or money in the game, and distribution, what's the return on investment. It's necessary to deal with succession in terms of one or more people dropping out of a joint venture. And in that regard, I might note that joint ventures are not necessarily limited to two parties. They can be multi-party ventures. One needs to deal with the liabilities and how that's going to occur. What's the term? Usually they're not, they don't last forever. And for certain small business rules, they're limited really to a 2-year period. And how can they be terminated? We'll note later that the SBA has a variety of requirements for mentor-protege and small business programs. But that's really the JVs in a nutshell. And we can now move on to some of the specialized programs on the next page, please. Two of these programs, which have become quite common, are one, the All Small Mentor Protege Program, which was developed in 2016, which is a follow-on to the SBA's old 8A Small Business Program, Mentor Program, and then the Small Business Set-Aside. The Mentor Protege Program is interesting because it is a horizontal teaming agreement in the form of a joint venture. A large, other than small, that's the proper term, entity can apply with a small business to seek a mentor protege JV creation that will provide assistance that is needed by the smaller business in developing its skills and capabilities. The large company can own up to about 40% of the protege. It leads to a written JV agreement, which will ID the small business's needs and can continue on for a period of 3 years with a potential 3-year extension. Parties are required to file annual reports and have to adhere to the requirements of the Mentor Protege Program. They can also pursue if the small business is qualified, you can pursue both small business set-asides and those for specialized small businesses such as veteran-owned businesses and the like. It's important to keep in mind the risk of non-compliance, which can lead to the disqualification of the large business from engaging in this kind of program in the future. And there have been, over the past several years, increased interest from the Justice Department under the False Claims Act. The Small Business Set-Aside Program is a similar program. It's been around for a long time, and it really allows two small businesses that are qualified to pursue opportunities together to increase their capabilities. There are a series of rules that must be followed, but again, that's a joint venture horizontal teaming arrangement. Next page, please. Let us turn to the vertical teaming arrangement, which is often thought of as the more traditional one. It, of course, involves a situation where there's a prime contractor and a potential subcontractor. And in those situations, both parties retain their separate identities. In theory, the teaming agreement is supposed to be a promise from the prime contractor that it will end up engaging the subcontractor if the prime wins an award of the government contract. I say in theory because despite the apparent intent of these agreements, this is the source of the greatest amount of litigation and disputes between primes and subs when the prime fails to deliver to the subcontractor all of the work that the subcontractor might have been expecting. Although many who call us ask us to dash up a teaming agreement, we're surprised that few come into us having thought through their unique circumstances. They fail to recognize that a teaming agreement involves a negotiation which reflects the tension that naturally exists between a prime and a sub in terms of the goals that it's looking for and in terms of flexibility, enforcement, and exclusivity. For the most part, prime contractors would like to delay and keep a teaming agreement loose for as long as possible so that it can maximize its options if it finds somebody better. A subcontractor wants to tie the prime in as much as possible and get guaranteed work, which is what it's seeking in that type of effort. That said, the tables can be reversed if a prime is negotiating with a critical subcontractor, and it's critical to tie them up during the process. And of course, both parties want to be able to have some flexibility if things go south. All of this gets manifested in negotiations in the precision of terms, the enforceability, and the escapability of the parties. Next page. Let's look at the key components of a teaming agreement. And in doing this, we're not going to go through each of the terms bit by bit by bit, but really a conceptual approach to the nature of a teaming agreement. So first of all, it has to identify the scope, the solicitation that you're working towards. And then it needs to specify the relationship of each party and what they're going to do. It often describes what the prime and the sub are going to be responsible for in developing the proposal to the government agency, who's going to take charge, things like that. Both parties are entered in exclusivity. Each party probably wants to tie up the other party, at least for that particular procurement. It becomes sensitive because one can't limit the ability of the subcontractor to otherwise market its services or products to the government. And so there's often a negotiation on how one might get out of that exclusive arrangement. And certainly when one's in it, it limits one's abilities to pursue other opportunities, perhaps with that agency. Of course, one is going to be dealing with proprietary information and IP, and one needs to deal with how one's going to handle that. I note that the continuation of the NDA and incorporation of the NDA into the teaming agreement is something that facilitates that process. The critical parts are going to be the process for entering into a subcontract, the terms of the subcontract, division of labor, pricing, things like that. Those, as we're going to see in a moment, are the absolute critical part of a teaming agreement because that is what determines its enforceability in the courts of the United States. It's important, as we get into that one avoid what is all too common and what's determined by the courts to be an agreement to agree, i.e. a situation where if the prime receives a contract, they agree to negotiate in good faith for 60 days, and at that point they can simply terminate the agreement. That has been the source of a great number of lawsuits over the years where the subcontracts put a lot of effort into it, only to find that the prime contractor cuts it out of the deal, either in the original teaming agreement or in a subsequent one. Because of this, the governing law that one puts into a teaming agreement becomes critical. Let's go to the next page, please. What this is leading up to is the critical issue in teaming agreements, which is enforceability. Throughout the United States, the various states have taken different approaches to how they deal with teaming agreements. And the biggest challenge for the parties is the enforceability of a teaming agreement. The states in this part of the country, Virginia, Maryland, and DC, all follow a fairly strict approach and require that really all the T's be crossed, the I's be dotted on a teaming agreement if it's to be enforced. And by that, there can't be an agreement to agree, which we talked about a moment ago. There can't be any undefined subcontract statement of work or pricing terms. And with respect to pricing, if the exact price isn't known at the time, that there needs to be an objective means to determining price when one is available. There also shouldn't be other open ends, like a loose, open-ended opportunity to be terminated subject to government approval. The need to have a proper term for the agreement, exclusivity, things like that. New York has been thought to be a somewhat looser jurisdiction in terms of allowing these type of agreements to be enforced. It really focuses on a bit looser attitude about pricing. California is the most loose and liberal about it. There is a court decision that allowed an oral teaming agreement to be enforced. Our thought is that teaming agreements always should be in writing. So in this regard, the negotiations for a teaming agreement and the choice of law is an important element of the entire process. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what are the key terms that are necessary to create an enforceable teaming agreement? The first one I note is the preamble. It is the often overlooked stepchild of an agreement and discarded or not considered to be a substantive part. And we would encourage that that is, in fact, the best place to set out one's story of why the two companies or more have gotten together, what their particular plans are with regard to a solicitation, and to state that there's a binding commitment that the parties will enter into a subcontract at the time. It's also important to set out the term of the agreement, the duration, and terminations. One wants to avoid a situation where the prime or the sub can simply terminate because they haven't been able to come to an agreement within a set period of time. It's probably appropriate to either not have that kind of clause or to tie it to some specific damages in the alternative, which we discuss in a moment. Having an exclusive arrangement helps, but obviously the parties want to be cautious about what they're signing up to. The really important part is the mandatory subcontract language. It would be ideal if the parties were able to negotiate a fully formed subcontract and make it an attachment to the teaming agreement. Those are the situations where the courts have had little difficulty in enforcing the teaming agreement because the ultimate agreement is there. But that failing, one can certainly agree to a number of terms in the subcontract. The most are the subcontractor's work share as being defined and specific and best if tied to the scope of work. The subcontractor pricing, ideally specific, but if not, tied to an objective standard. Those, and then there are a number of others, the term, exclusivity, things like that. The more that get included in the teaming agreement, either within the body of the teaming agreement as a mandatory subcontract clause or as an attachment to the teaming agreement, the better chances are that it'll be enforced. This also might include the incorporation of flow-down clauses that'll be included. The remedies is important. All too often, those are overlooked. It doesn't help in the enforceability, but it may help in securing a teaming agreement, whereas instead of just leaving it to litigation or arbitration, one were to agree to the imposition of liquidated damages if the subcontractor were not to obtain the desired subcontract. Next page, please. Let us now turn to the subcontract, which, as I said, is the ultimate goal. It's the end of the process. It's defined in the FAR on these pages, and it's really any kind of agreement between a prime and a sub. Some are surprised to find that it includes purchase orders and things like that. And the definition of a subcontractor is not just somebody who is going to perform part of the subcontracted work itself, but suppliers, distributors, or vendors may be included, which raises a number of issues that are a little bit outside the scope of this seminar. Next, please. Subcontract key terms. You know, when we get people calling up and asking for a subcontract, they also have not thought about exactly what they want. And we've also seen subcontract agreements that are but a few pages to those running 60 and 70 pages with small print. But at its core, there are really some terms that should be part of it, and the rest is not necessarily fluff, but an effort to try and address all the potential things that might go wrong in a subcontract. The key terms, obviously, are the statement of work. What are we going to be doing on this project? How long is it going to last? And what is the respective, job that the subcontractor will have? What am I going to get paid, or what am I going to have to pay for the work? How do I get to inspect and accept the work? And obviously how it's going to be delivered, all of which leads hopefully to you getting paid. We've talked about throughout the process about confidentiality of information and proprietary information and IP. That is certainly something that needs to be addressed, and particularly from a subcontractor's point of view, that its rights be preserved through the process of what is really a private sector agreement between two private parties to which there's some government benefits attached. One also wants to talk about changes and whether the prime contractor can change things separate and apart from the government, or whether it's tied to the government. Termination, similarly, whether it has to be tied to government action. Governing law, although often imposed by the prime contractor as the law it prefers, that is something that can be of negotiation, perhaps as to the location of where the work is going to be performed. Disputes and liability, how do you resolve things when things go south? And then liability, limiting it. Can you limit it to some amount? Obviously want to get rid of various unexpected damages, lost profits, and things like that. The other aspect that gets brought in is the prime contract flowdowns. From a prime's perspective, they will seek often to flow down all of the prime contract flowdown clauses, the FAR clauses. A subcontractor may have a different view, and we mention them as being included in the teaming agreement, we have noticed over the years that the flow-down clauses may change between a teaming and agreement and a subcontract. It's important to review them, and it's important for a subcontractor to push back as appropriate on those clauses that may be extraneous or burdensome. There are a host of other clauses, of course, that one could have, and we've noted them there as a point of interest. Next page. We just note quickly in passing that you should keep in mind that when dealing with small businesses, the concept of affiliation, which is the association which the SBA does between two or more companies, is something that you need to watch out for. There's an exception for approved mentor protege and small business J fees, but it's something that one needs to worry about. Next page. In terms of practice tips, I think what's important is that one needs to consider a teaming agreement and subcontract, not just in isolation, but in relationship to your overall business goals. In doing so, what are the factors that the government is looking for in a solicitation, and how can you use a team to improve your chances? It's essential to conduct due diligence on your prospective teaming agreements, depending on how important they are to the deal. If they're a critical subcontractor, you also might seek to escrow their IP and other things, or you might seek to do additional due diligence. Confirm the source selection, negotiate a complete and enforceable teaming agreement, and certainly beware of the implications for small business. I thank you for your time this afternoon. I appreciate you spending part of your afternoon with me. And should you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you very much. And with that, I turn it back over to Jennifer Schaus and Company. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us today. And like he said, if you have new questions, please feel free to reach out with him with the email or phone number shown on your screen. This concludes the webinar. Thank you.